Recently, we explored the principle of reaping what you sow in a more positive light. Sunday morning, we focused on the work of the Jerusalem church and how, through their righteous action and benevolence, God allowed them to reap the consequences of their deeds decades later. And tonight, I want us to look at the other side of the coin. I want us to consider the consequences of sowing evil in this life and how it can not just affect our own life, but sometimes our descendants and our community. So let's begin in 2 Samuel chapter 21, and we'll begin by reading verses 1 through 2. 2 Samuel 21, verses 1 through 2. Now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year, and David sought the face of the Lord. And the Lord said, "There is blood guilt on Saul and on his house, because he put the Gibeonites to death." So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the people of Israel, but of the remnant of the Ammonites. Although the people of Israel had sworn to spare them, Saul had sought to strike them down in his zeal for the people of Israel and Judah. Now, one of the first things we want to note is that there was a famine for 3 years. And as students of the Bible and of the Old Testament, we should note that this is an indication that something is not right, that Israel had not been obedient to God. As we see in Deuteronomy chapter 28, Israel was promised to be blessed in the areas of their land, of their barns, if they were faithful to God, if they were obedient to his will. And the fact that they are not being blessed in these areas is an indication that something has gone wrong. But why did it take them 3 years to address God? It's not exactly clear. Maybe the first year wasn't as bad. Maybe they thought the second year was a fluke. But by the third year, they're beginning to think, okay, we've done something wrong. And of course, the question is, why did it take so long for David to go to God? Now, when we get towards the ending of 2 Samuel, we see some stories of David and his life that are a little less glamorous, at least in many of them. And so maybe this is an indication that David didn't really do his part, or maybe he took too much time here. Now, it says that he sought the face of God, although likely not literally. When we consider the entire story of David's life, we don't actually find a single example of him talking to God directly like Moses did, or on occasion as his son Solomon did. He likely went through Nathan, or maybe through Abiathar the high priest, where he consulted the Urim and the Thummim. Regardless of how he addressed God or went to seek God, God did indicate that the reason he withheld, or the reason that he allowed this famine to continue, was because there was sin committed in the land. Saul had put to death the Gibeonites. But who are the Gibeonites? Thankfully, in verse 2, we have a short summarization of who they are, but if you wanted the more detailed story, you can consult Joshua chapter 9. And what we find in Joshua chapter 9 is that these were actually some of the people God had doomed to destruction because of their generations of sin. However, they were able to deceive the Israelites. They put on very old clothes, and they had very old bread and very old sandals, and they made it appear as though they had traveled from a distant land and were seeking to enter into an alliance with Israel. And as we see, Israel believed them. It says in Joshua 9:15, Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the leaders of the congregation swore to them. When it turned out that they had lied and they were actually Canaanites, essentially the people of Israel were like, okay, let's get them. Thankfully, the elders were wise enough to know better. They concluded that if we break our covenant that we had made before God, his wrath will be upon us. This is what they say to them. We have sworn to them by Yahweh, the God of Israel, and now we may not touch them. And as we see, especially in the book of Joshua, they were faithful to this covenant. Even when the Gibeonites were attacked by their enemies, they went and protected them. We don't have a lot of information from that point on to this part in the biblical narrative, but everything we have seems to indicate that they were faithful to this covenant until the days of Saul, where Saul was finished with them, and he decided to put them to death. Now, we're not told all the details, but what we have is not good. In verse 1, it says he put the Gibeonites to death. In verse 2, it says he struck them down because of his zeal for Israel and Judah. we find in verse 5 that they said, "This man, Saul, consumed us and planned to destroy us so that we would have no place in all the territory of Israel." Now, I think it's important just to consider this one definition of genocide to maybe put in perspective how terrible this was. One definition is that genocide is the deliberate and systematic destruction of a group of people because of their ethnicity, or their nationality, or religion, or race. And that certainly seems to be what we find here. Saul wanted them gone, and so he sought to kill them. And thankfully, he was not completely successful. But we can imagine, based off what we know of Saul, that it was pretty bad. Consider what Saul did to his own people in 1 Samuel chapter 22, verse 18. And these were Israelites, and he killed every person in that community. And if he was willing to do that to his own people, God only knows the extent to which he butchered the Gibeonites. But because Israel had betrayed their allies that they had sworn to protect, God was now punishing them and the entire house of Israel for this vendetta that was implemented by Saul. Now keep in mind, the bloodshed of the innocent is heinous in the sight of God. Notice what Moses says in Numbers chapter 35, verses 33 through 34. We find this idea that bloodshed specifically pollutes or taints the land. Moses says, "You shall not pollute the land in which you live, for blood pollutes the land. And no atonement can be made for the land for the blood that is shed in it, except by the one of the blood who shed it. You shall not defile the land in which you live, in the midst for which I dwell. For I, the Lord, dwell in the midst of the people of Israel." Therefore, because Israel had allowed their land to be polluted, God allowed a famine to terrorize them. Thus, David realized that he had to act. And let's consider what he does in verses 3 through 14. 2 Samuel chapter 21, verses 3 through 14. "And David said to the Gibeonites, 'What shall I do for you? And how shall I make atonement that you may bless the heritage of Yahweh?' The Gibeonites said to him, 'It is not a matter of silver or gold between us and Saul or his house, neither is it for us to put any man to death in Israel.' And he said, What do you say that I shall do for you?' They said to the king, the man who consumed us and planned to destroy us, so that we should have no place in all the territory of Israel, let 7 of his sons be given to us, so that we may hang them before the Lord at Gibeah of Saul, the chosen of Yahweh. And the king said, I will give them. And the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Saul's son Jonathan, because of the oath of the Lord that was between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. The king took the 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, whom she bore to Saul, Armoni and Mephibosheth, a different one than what's mentioned before, and the 5 sons of Merab, the daughter of Saul, whom she had bore to Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Mahalahite. And he gave them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they hanged them on the mountain before the Lord. And the 7 of them perished together. They were put to death in the first days of harvest at the beginning of barley harvest. Then Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it for herself on the rock from the beginning of harvest until rain fell upon them from the heavens. And she did not allow the birds of the air to come upon them by day, or the beasts of the field by night. When David was told what Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, the concubine of Saul, had done, David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan from the men of, start again at verse 12. David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan from the men of Jabesh Gilead, who had stolen them from the public square of Bethshan, where the Philistines had hanged them on the day the Philistines killed Saul on Gilboa. And he brought up from there the bones of Saul and the bones of the son of Jonathan, and they gathered the bones of those who were hanged, and they buried the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan in the land of Benjamin in Zelah, in the tomb of Kish his father. And they did all that the king commanded, and after that God responded to the plea for the land. Now we see that David goes to the Gibeonites to help them find justice, which is the right thing to do. And they acknowledge that they don't want silver or gold, and it does not appear that they want to put anyone else to death in the land of Israel. But we see that they ask for specifically seven of Saul's male descendants to be put to death. Likely the rationale is that this is ultimately Saul's fault, therefore judgment should fall on his house. And they're also likely thinking to themselves that he has severely decimated their people, therefore Saul's house must be decimated. And David agrees to their wishes. Now many ask, was this actually the right thing to do? Was this a just thing to do in Israel? And it's a heavily debated subject. Some would argue that this violates the principle of Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 16, where Moses says, "Fathers shall not be put to death because of their children, nor shall children be put to death because of their fathers. Each shall be put to death for his own sin." However, we could see this in a different way. So we could say that Saul's sons are not being punished for Saul's sin, but Saul himself is being punished. Keep in mind that for an ancient Near Eastern man, and for most men throughout the ages, one of the most important things is the idea of their legacy, as their name continues through their descendants. And we see a similar example, for example, in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 15, where God personally afflicts Saul's child, the first child that he conceives with Bathsheba, because of David's own sin. And again, it's not a punishment on the child, though the child is negatively impacted. It is a punishment on David. And this could be what we are reading here, that even though Saul's sons are suffering, the punishment is for Saul. But regardless, David is forced to select 7 male descendants of Saul. Now keep in mind, this is not something that he would want to do. David loved Saul, and he loved Saul's family. In fact, as soon as he became king, anyone who tried to harm Saul's family, he put to death. So he obviously does not select Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, because they had a covenant together. So he selects the 2 sons of Rizpah and the 5 sons of Merab, this was Saul's daughter who married Adriel. Now you might have something in your Bible that says Michal. There appears to be some kind of textual variant. What we note from 1 Samuel 18:19 that it's Merab who marries Adriel, not Michal. So it appears that it's Merab and Merab's 5 sons that are listed here. And thus they are handed over to the Gibeonites. And during the beginning of barley harvest, which would have been around April or May, they put them to death together, and they suspend them in the air. Now, there's a particular feature about this that seems off. What we do find in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 22 through 23, that it was not uncommon for someone who had been executed to be suspended in the air. However, it was only supposed to be for a day. They were supposed to be taken down the same day they were put up. However, these men are here for what appears to be a significant amount of time. And if the rain is an indication, if it's emphasizing the raining season, it may be several weeks, if not several months. Now, we do see here that there is perhaps one of the most beautiful pictures of honoring the dead. Rizpah, now keep in mind, Rizpah was one of the wives of Saul, and she has had a rough life. She has seen bloody civil wars. She has seen much of her family be killed, and now she has to witness the death of her 2 remaining sons and 5 of her nephews. And even though she can't do much, she does everything to preserve their remaining dignity. She sets herself up in the presence of their bodies, and keep in mind, she herself is exposed to the elements, and she determines to preserve their bodies as much as she can. Now, keep in mind the wildlife in Israel at this time. It's not just birds she's dealing with. They have wolves, bears, and lions. And we can imagine many of her relatives tried to talk her out of this, but she was determined to protect her family. And so, likely with nothing more than a long stick, whenever birds came, she would shoo them away. And whenever perhaps an opportunistic predator came, or a carnivore, not a carnivore, scavenger, thank you. Scavenger came by, she would stand her ground and protect her family. And we see in verse 11 that when this was told to David, he gathered up their bodies and united their bodies with Saul and the rest of their family. And perhaps this is something that David should have done anyway. After all, you're not supposed to let a body stay out this long, and perhaps this is an indication that Rizpah was doing a job that David was supposed to do. But regardless, after justice had been executed for the Gibeonites, God allowed rain to return to the land. Now, what can we draw from this very bitter story in Israel's history? One of the first things we should observe is that God cares deeply about justice. And there's a bit of irony in this passage because keep in mind, originally the Gibeonites had been doomed to destruction. They were not even supposed to be there. But because they were taken advantage of, but because they were mistreated, God determined that they were entitled to justice. And he knew how Saul had treated them was completely uncalled for. Therefore, he allowed Israel to suffer 3 years of famine and for Saul's house to suffer. Now, one good question we might ask is, why did God wait so long? Now, it is kind of difficult to determine how long he waited, but it could have easily been 3 or 4 decades before God had held Israel accountable. Why didn't he punish Saul immediately? This actually comes in reference to the concept of free will. We do know that God does give us free will. He does respect our choices. And because of this, sometimes he allows the rewards or the consequences of our choices to not be given immediately. Consider it this way. Imagine if God punished everyone immediately every time they lied. As soon as a person lied, he immediately chopped off one of their limbs. Do you think anybody would lie? Probably not, because the consequences were so severe and so immediate. Now, even though they had the option or have the option to lie, they're not going to exercise it, and it is as though they don't really have free will in that area. And so what we find as a consequence of the importance of free will is that God often sits back and will often wait before consequences or rewards are given out. And he did give Israel plenty of time to take responsibility for what they had done. And if they had acted sooner, if they had taken this responsibility on sooner, yes, Saul's house would have suffered, but they wouldn't have had to deal with 3 years' worth of famine. Another thing we should draw from this passage is that, individually speaking, we should, if we realize that we have wronged someone, we should act quickly to make amends. And obviously, on a personal level, it might be a little bit easier to do because if it's one person that's wronged another, that's obviously easier than an entire group. And sometimes all that is needed is a sincere apology, especially if the wrong that is committed is just a social infraction. And we as Christians, especially as members of the body of Christ, this should be something we are eager to do, something we do quickly so that we can maintain the bond of brotherhood. Paul reminds us in Colossians 3:13 that we are to bear with one another. And if anyone has a complaint against each other, we should forgive each other. But as we also see in Luke chapter 17, verses 3 through 4, the guilty party has a responsibility to sincerely repent. And of course, we do know that sometimes more than a sincere apology is needed. A brother or sister in Christ can make a mistake either through negligence that might cause another brother or sister to be harmed, maybe in a financial way. And as we see in passages like 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 1 through 8, we have a responsibility to make that right with each other and ideally within the church itself. Jesus also emphasizes in passages like Matthew chapter 5, verse 25, that if we wrong someone of the world, we have an obligation to make amends as quickly as possible. He says that we are to come to terms quickly with our accuser, even if you're on the way to court. And Jesus, very clearly says, it's better that we deal with the issue than it go into the hands of lawyers and judges. Now, one thing we should remember is that God often does give us time to make things right, to own up to what we do, to take responsibility. But if we take too long, his patience can run out. And he might decide to step in and allow us to deal with the consequences of our actions if we take too much time. But as we see also from 2 Samuel chapter 21, is that this is not just true for individuals, but for groups as well. We know throughout history there have always been institutions or governments that have oppressed or mistreated those who were different than them. And God has always expected a reckoning. And if that nation or that group doesn't take responsibility upon themselves, God ensures the reckoning himself. And even today, we understand that if there is a nation or there's a local government that does something wrong or mistreats a particular group, some kind of restitution has to be made. I think I was able to find maybe one good example of this. Hopefully there's more, but this is the one that came to mind that shows maybe a modern example of how this should be done. Consider our war with Imperial Japan in the 1940s. We know, of course, that Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, brought us into World War II, initiated a war with them and with Nazi Germany. Now, the U.S. government and the military was concerned that Japan might initiate a land assault on our western coast. But the question that some had is, well, we have many Japanese American citizens that are there. If Japan invades, are they going to be loyal to the U.S. government, or are they going to be loyal to Imperial Japan? Well, unfortunately, the U.S. government decided it would be safer if we just put them in internment camps until the end of the war. Now, obviously, we know that that was the wrong thing to do. If someone is a U.S. citizen and has pledged loyalty to the United States, we should not doubt their sincerity just because they have a different ancestry than the majority. Thankfully, the U.S. government realized decades later that this was a wrong and immoral thing to do. They did try to create some kind of restitution a little bit earlier, but you know how slow Congress can be sometimes. But by 1988, they passed the Civil Liberties Act that awarded $20,000 to each Japanese American that was forced to remain in such a camp. Of course, $20,000 was a little bit more back then. We might say, well, maybe they deserved more or something like that, but I think maybe this is a good modern example of a nation or one group doing wrong thing and then trying to make restitution. However, when we look at our history, the history of other nations, we don't always find such an examples. Therefore, God has to step in and execute judgment. Now, of course, we know it's hard to know the mind of God. It's hard to understand how he weighs the scales of each nation and what is an act of judgment. But when we look at things, for example, like the American Civil War, and we consider the amount of lives that were lost, we know that 750,000 Americans died in that conflict. Countless cities were looted and burned. It's hard not to ask, well, if perhaps we had been more humane to certain groups, could that have been avoided altogether? After all, many of the things we read in the Civil War are things that we read of throughout the Scriptures as acts of judgment. But a more daunting thought is, well, if that was a reckoning, would God ever bring a similar reckoning again, especially in reference to abortion and all the little children that die every single day? Remember what Moses said in Numbers chapter 35, verse 33. No atonement can be made for the land, for the blood that is shed in it, except by the one who shed it. And how can a society atone for such atrocities? And would it even be possible to turn things around before it is too late? Another thing to consider is the problem with Saul as king. And we see this, unfortunately, throughout history in many different leaders and in many different people, where certain individuals are so filled with a deep sense of prejudice and a lack of regard for human life that they commit atrocities. But in the very life of Saul, there is a strange sense of irony that we sometimes see repeated throughout history. What we find from 1 Chronicles chapter 8, verses 29 through 35, is that Saul wasn't just a Benjaminite. He was also a Gibeonite as well, at least to some degree. What we find in 1 Chronicles chapter 8 is that he can trace his lineage all the way back to the father of Gibeah himself, a man by the name of Jael, through his father Cush. And it's a sad irony to think that he could be so destructive against people that he's so similar to. But if you think about it, when it comes to these kinds of prejudice, that all of us were not really that different. After all, as we see very clearly in Acts chapter 17, verse 26, that God has created each of us from one blood and one man. And that a prejudice against someone who looks slightly different or has a more recent ancestry that's kind of different, that it's just as ridiculous. In fact, there was this really funny story several years ago. There was a man by the name of Craig Kopp, who is a white supremacist who decided to build his all-white community in South Dakota. At least he attempted to do so. But he was shocked to find out that through his own ancestry, he was 14% sub-Saharan African. The question is, would he be unqualified for this all-white community that he's trying to build? But this is how ridiculous prejudice is. Because when we trace back our ancestry, according to the Bible, we know we are all from one man and one blood. And to hate someone else who appears to be slightly different is no different than hating ourselves. But because of Saul's own hatred for the Gibeonites and his disregard for others, he reaped consequences for his own nation and his own family. And of course, we as Christians ought to be mindful of this. And of course, I'm not worried about us doing anything as extreme. But the principle is there that when we commit deeds or do things in life, whether they're good or bad, we will always reap the effect. And hopefully, we as Christians are sowing righteousness in our life. And hopefully, we are doing our best to ensure that the will of God is performed on earth as it is in heaven. And if perhaps we are sowing the wrong things in our life, maybe in our minds, in our hearts, or in our attitude toward others, we can be certain that we will reap the consequences of that in some way. And if anyone is here tonight and perhaps they sense something within inside their lives that is inconsistent with the will of God, we know God has given us this day to make things right, to make a change. And he gave the Israelites, thankfully, plenty of decades, and we know at the very least he has given us this day, and we do not know if he will give us tomorrow. But if you're here today and you feel that you need to make a change, we'd be glad to pray for you. We know God will forgive you. He will give you the strength and the wisdom to do better. But if you're here today and perhaps you're not a Christian, but you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, you're willing to repent of your sins and put Christ on in baptism, we can assist you with that as well. If there's anything we can do for you at this time, please come forward as we stand and sing.